WHO Special Envoy for COVID-19, Dr. David Nabarro. Welcome to the Czech Radio. Welcome to 20 Minutes.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
The World Health Organization admitted this week that the coronavirus can be spread by tiny particles suspended in the air, not only by droplets we sneeze or cough. What implications this news has for the prevention of COVID-19?
Thanks very much for this question. Because this particular virus is primarily spread through droplet infection, we have said the main way of avoiding infection is to keep at least 1 meter distance from other people. Plus, we add to that, we encourage people to cover their faces now in order, again, to reduce the risk of transmission.
Exactly.
There is also a possibility that certain droplets may become really small. So instead of being actual drops of fluid within which there's virus, they are airborne particles, tiny particles, and that these may move more than this 1 to 2 meter distance. These tiny particles are what then can become airborne. And we know that under certain circumstances, airborne transmission is possible. We just do not think it is the primary mode of transmission.
But it seems, if I may,
Yeah.
it seems to me, looking from a distance, if I may say so, that the WHO refused to approve of this possibility you are speaking about.
Never, no.
Which, in my understanding, prevented us to improve our protection against the virus. You don't agree?
I just tell you straight away, WHO is not in the situation where if a science is saying something, that then the WHO refuses it. I mean, what's happened here is a group of scientists who are particularly skilled in looking at patterns of airflow and so on have come together and produced a letter. This is not uncommon. You often get groups of scientists who want to make a point very strongly, producing a letter on any aspect of health and writing to the WHO Director General. And of course, the organization is basically assembling science from lots of sources. There's never a sense of refusing to approve something simply out of pique. What the organization does is it filters and looks at all the different sources of information. And what it said was the primary means of transmission is through droplets. But aerosol does occur. And I was about to say 2 situations in particular that are well known. One is when people sing, it seems that particles get aerosolized. And the second is that in certain kinds of ventilation system, aerosolization is more likely. It seems that the ventilation increases the likelihood that droplets turn into particles. So no, absolutely no question of things being refused. It's just that you're balancing up lots of different science and you're trying to offer to people the best information you've got, and that's how it works. And sometimes when new evidence comes along, you have to change your guidance, and that's again totally normal in this kind of organization.
Understood. Let me use a local example, if I may. There is an unpleasant outbreak of COVID-19 in the mines of northern Moravia, about 3 hours drive from Prague. Could the air in the mines possibly contain the tiny particles you spoke about?
You know, one of the things that I can't do from here is to actually make a detailed analysis of what's happening where you are or where you're talking about. That's because each situation, it requires careful analysis. Number one, what is the airflow in this setting like? Is there proper circulation of air, including a replacement of used air, or is it circulation of air that's already been round once or twice or 3 times? Secondly, are the people concerned actually wearing various face protections and so on to reduce their risk? And then thirdly, are we able to get any information about other aspects of these people? For example, do they live together in the same dwelling area? So might the transmission have taken place in the home or on transportation or whatever? So I just have to say to viewers that in this kind of analysis, we need really to get into detail and work out what are the aspects of the working situation that seem to be creating the greatest risk. This applies in mines, it applies in food processing plants, it applies in garment manufacturing plants, all these settings where people are close together.
There is another item which is actual now. Donald Trump accused your organization for being under China's control, and now the US are pulling out of the WHO and redirecting their funding elsewhere. What does it mean for your organization?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that in health, the world relies on health professionals like myself having a space where we can meet together and we can talk about things without fear. You need a safe space because we all work for one thing, and that is for the good health of everybody, regardless of nationality, sex, class, ethnicity. Everybody's got the same value. And we respond to everybody, every nation equally. That's how we are made. That's how we work. I've been doing this kind of work for 40 years or more.
Yep.
We don't have favorites, but we are governed by the world's nations, and the world's nations do disagree with each other. And they often want to find reasons to make unpleasant remarks about each other. That's not us. We're just ordinary doctors who are trying to do our job. And so if there is a dispute between our owners, that we understand, but we wish they could sort their dispute out without damaging our little organization and without then having a bad effect for the people of the world. The people of the world depend on health experts coming together to find solutions to problems like the one you just discussed with me.
Of course, it makes a lot of sense to me.
Walking out weakens the world's response. That's a pity. I'm sorry. I'm sad. I'm disappointed. I'm also amazed because the World Health Organization has benefited from brilliant support from United States experts for years. All the work I've done on pandemic preparedness, on responding to Ebola, on responding to influenza. WHO and the UN were massively supported by the United States. Brilliant support, brilliant contribution. So I'm sad for the world.
Dr. Nabarro, there was a recent survey in the Czech Republic, and about 2/3 of the Czechs expect a second wave of the disease. Will there be a second wave? And if yes, when?
It'll come pretty soon. The reason is that this virus is still very much here. It's in Czech. It's in United Kingdom. It's where I am, here in Switzerland. The movement restrictions and lockdowns that many countries have done have slowed the virus down, but it's still here. And as we start moving, then we will get more cases, and we will get not so much second waves, we will get spikes, resurgence. And what we have to do is we have to be ready for them, and we have to suppress them by finding people with the disease and isolating them really fast. And then we can get on top of these outbreaks and we don't get paralyzed by them. We don't feel the need to reimpose strong lockdowns. So the new normal that we're all moving into all over the world is one of changing our personal behavior so we reduce the risk. And then secondly, being ready to deal with outbreaks when they come. And then we'll be able to get on with our lives.
When I look around not only in the Czech Republic, but the whole Europe, there is summertime, which means more travel and I think a bigger probability of a return of a disease. Is that right?
Yes, with one or two caveats. But let me just say straight away that, I mean, like everybody else, I'm concerned about the amount of movement that is happening. And my worry that this will lead to new spikes and recurrences is just that outdoors, the risk is much less. So I'm quite comfortable about people moving around outdoors. I worry about what happens indoors if they're in a hostel or if they are in a bar and then perhaps all clustered together. Then I think the problem might be greater. Secondly, I am hopeful that the virus is less easily transmitted in hot weather. So perhaps there'll be two things that will save us a little bit. But I have to say, I think you're right. And I think in many countries, this virus is going to cause major problems in the coming weeks, partly because we don't take it seriously enough, and partly because the virus is still very much here, and we have to be very respectful of it.
You have mentioned a resurgence or outbreaks or new hotspots. They are reported almost everywhere. I mentioned one in the Czech Republic in those mines. There are some in Western Germany, British Midlands, elsewhere. I know you cannot be specific, but when you look at these hotspots, do they have similarities so that you could say perhaps this is a typical place for another outbreak?
There are a few places where we are tending to see outbreaks. The first, hospitals. The second, residential care for older people. Thirdly, factories which are cold, where people are close together, like meat or fish. And other factories where perhaps people are just very close together for long periods of time, like garment. You've just also described mining, and I've heard about 2 other mining outbreaks. Then public transport. It seems that people who are driving buses are at risk. People who are security guards, or people who are working in shops, but at the tills of a shop, especially if there's no protection for them. So yes, there are certain occupations, certain kinds of dwelling where the risk seems to be greater. And I did mention that indoors is more serious than outdoors. I believe that if you adopt this approach of looking at higher risk settings, this will actually greatly improve one's ability to anticipate outbreaks and deal with them fast.
Our Ministry of Foreign Affairs runs an advisory system in the form of traffic lights. Yes. And all European countries are green or yellow, only Sweden and United Kingdom are red. Is that fair?
Oh, I'm not going to answer that question in the way that you've asked it, because the decision about how to classify countries has to be a decision made by the government of Czech. And so I don't think it is right for me even to question that decision, because I don't know the basis under which the decision was made. But what I can tell you,
if I ask you, if you let me, as a doctor or an epidemiologist, would you agree that the situation concerning COVID-19 in Sweden and United Kingdom is considerably different from the rest of Europe?
Again, I don't want to answer the question as you're asking it. I want to say the following. Number one, all countries are trying to make sure that their case numbers are kept down. Number two, all countries are trying to build up their capacity to identify and contain new outbreaks very quickly. And number three, each of the countries in Europe has a slightly different trajectory, and some of them are better functioning in terms of being able to prevent disease outbreaks than others. But at the same time, there are very, very big risks faced by all countries in Europe. And I think I'd like every European leader to be doing everything possible to try to get on top of those. And I know I haven't answered your question, and I hope you will excuse me, but it's not helpful for me to answer the question as you posed it, at least not right now.
You answered the question in a way, but I have another question. Yeah. Everything will be different if there is a vaccine.
Correct.
How soon shall we have one?
So, whenever we have a disease against which we're trying to develop a vaccine, the first thing that's necessary is to have the candidate for the vaccine, which is usually a bit of the virus that's been multiplied and then inactivated. And then you have to test that to see whether it actually produces a response in animals and then in humans. And then you have to check to see whether or not that response is strong, and whether or not in producing the response inside a person, it's safe and it doesn't cause any kind of side effects. And let's say you've gone through all that, you have what you feel looks like a vaccine. You've then got to get it licensed, and then you've got to manufacture it, and you've got to make sure that everybody can get it. What I'm trying to point out is there are a lot of steps, and they take time. And you have to have good fortune, because you don't always succeed when you're going through these steps. It's not mechanical. And I believe that it is 18 months before we will have licensed vaccines available. And I think it's at least 2.5 years before the world's population will be able to be fully immunized. And so that's why I'm saying to everybody, please plan on living without a vaccine for 2.5 years.
But your colleague, chief scientist for the WHO, Soumya Swaminathan, says Oxford University, specifically Jenner Institute, has developed the most promising vaccine so far. And if they are successful, then we could have approved and available vaccine in less than a year. So is your colleague too optimistic?
I know Soumya really well. And I actually have read some of the interviews that she's done. I think we're all really scared of being asked to say, how quickly could it come? I am typically a bit cautious when it comes to making predictions. And I think Soumya is very much, by the way, she's got more scientific information than I've got. She's very much looking on the most optimistic scenario. I'm focusing on having enough vaccine for the whole world. And that's because I want to be sure that it's not just going to a small group of wealthier people. That's why I'm going to give my longer time interval. But at the same time, of course, Dr. Soumya is actually very right to be giving an optimistic scenario, but you'll see that she always qualifies her predictions by stressing that a lot of things have to go well to fit into this short time frame.
And she doesn't seem to be alone. The British pharmaceutical company AstraZeneca confirmed 2 billion doses of the COVID-19 vaccine have been ordered, and Britain should have 30 million in September. In my view, nobody would order and pay for a thing with dubious future. Isn't that another sign that a reliable vaccine is coming sooner than you expect?
I very much hope that the promise of the AstraZeneca vaccine does actually get delivered. I very much hope that the other company is an American company that's also doing advanced sales of its vaccine is successful. I know that everybody concerned is doing due diligence. Remember, I've been involved in quite a number of vaccine development efforts. I've also understood some of the challenges that can occur. And I just repeat to you, I do not want, myself at least, to be being found to have been over-optimistic. If people are starting making personal planning decisions or commercial decisions or whatever, based on an expectation that a vaccine will be available in a particular time, I think it's most unfortunate. So I'm going to stick with my 2.5 years. I agree that there are some very promising noises being made by some companies, but I would just like everybody to be aware that vaccine production is not a mechanical process. It's a biological process, and things have to go right. And there are all sorts of questions about immunity in relation to this particular virus. So let's just wait and see and watch and have our findings interpreted for us very carefully without necessarily coming to any firm conclusion on timing.
How many people must be vaccinated to ensure the society as such is protected against the coronavirus? Is it 80%?
Well, there are various people using models who will give you numbers. I want to tell you that because of the particular way in which this virus spreads through primarily droplet infection, and because the fact that the outbreaks are very focal, the actual level of immunity in a population after it's been affected by a large number of people with COVID is still relatively small. There's a lot of susceptibles. Even in New York, there's an awful lot of susceptibles despite the high level of disease. So my assumption, like many others, is that you would need to have really somewhere in the region of 70 to 80% of the population immune for there to be the sufficient immunity for the capacity for outbreaks to develop to be very, very small. And so that sort of figure means that you either have to have a pretty good vaccination coverage or you have to have had a lot of disease for there to be sufficient immunity for there not to be outbreaks.
So if there is a vaccine against COVID-19 sooner or later, will the WHO be able to do something to get the vaccine to the poor patients? You know, to ensure the critical amount of immunized people?
Huge effort underway. I would like everybody to know this. The WHO, as an organization, working with a lot of different partners, is doing everything it possibly can to ensure that as the vaccines become available, they are accessible to poor people in poor communities, in poor countries in our world. That is very much the focus of the WHO. It follows a resolution in the World Health Assembly in May this year. And it is the kind of thing that the WHO really focuses on. It's what the world asks it to do.
If I look back a little bit, if I may, your colleagues from the Imperial College in London estimate that Europe's policies applied this spring prevented 3 million deaths in Europe. I don't know how they counted it. You probably do. Does that mean that the old-fashioned strategies we use, that is, stay-at-home orders, wear face masks, wash your hands, and so on, proved reliable?
I personally believe that the extraordinary efforts by European nations to reduce transmission have had a massive impact in terms of lives saved. And I think that they're still having that impact. You know, movement is still quite reduced compared with what it was like this time last year. People have changed their behavior. And so my statement back to you would be that it's not just what was done in the past few weeks and months, it's also what is continuing to be done now that is having a huge impact. Yeah.
When we speak about the ways of protection, I would return to face mask, which is particularly interesting in the Czech Republic, because our public was rather confused when our government made masks in public compulsory in March and April, and the WHO declared the masks are no good as they do not really protect you if they are not professionally made. Have the organization changed their mind concerning the face masks?
So the original guidance from WHO made the following points. Number one, really sophisticated masks, the N95 or FP3 masks are the best masks to protect yourself against being infected. And they're really...
Yes, no question about it.
They should be worn by health workers. And the whole effort by WHO at a time when the world had a shortage of these masks was to try to get them used by all health workers. And I remember watching the debates take place, and the centerpiece was health workers everywhere need to be protected, otherwise they will die. And so that was overriding consideration one. Overriding consideration number two was, how can we make certain that people understand what we believe the science is? And the answer was to try to find a different term from masks for face protection. And in the early guidance, the term face covering or face protection was used. The point was made that it seems that face protection can reduce the likelihood that if you've got the virus, you transmit it to other people. And that's based on some quite ancient work, but it's work that I think is still valid. And so the WHO did start saying, if you think you might have the virus, you should isolate. But if you're not sure, then you should consider wearing a face mask. Now then, more recent research came along, and it is quite recent, saying that actually masks also seem to have value when you are trying to prevent yourself from being exposed. And that led to a slight shift in the guidance. And I think that is a point I want to keep saying, that the WHO all the time is dealing with new evidence. I was told that something in the region of 500 scientific papers are being published every day about COVID. These have to be reviewed. And when new evidence comes along, they will change their guidance. And I'm sorry if it's confusing people, but this is a new virus. We've only known about it for 6 months. We're learning all the time. So shift in guidance, yes. Reason for the earlier guidance, I think, is explicable, but I'd say it again, was trying to protect health workers, a really important and I believe valid concern. Shift to new guidance later was because new evidence came along suggesting a much stronger and more effective role for masking.
I understand your arguments perfectly, but I'm speaking about signals, yes, like the following one. On March the 20th, the WHO representative in Slovakia went on TV program without a face mask, and he said that he does not want to spread fear and that a mask in public space is not necessary. Was that a reasonable thing to do?
I can't comment on the circumstances. I think by and large, most of us, when we're, for example, doing television or radio or other such things, we tend not to wear masks, provided we're doing physical distancing. I think that if we are close and if we're greeting people and so on, more and more we should be wearing masks. And obviously, I'm not going to comment on the individual case, but certainly with regard to me, I am wearing face masks in public settings, in shops, in markets and such like, for two reasons. One is obviously I don't want to affect others, but two, I want to tell you that I am scared. I'm 70 and I've had high blood pressure. And the last thing I want is to get this virus. So if I do wear a mask, it's not so much me wanting to communicate messages to others. It's because of me.
But I was referring more to the explanation your colleague made, saying that he's not wearing face protection, as you say it, not to spread fear. Is that reasonable? You know, if you have something on your face, it may make other people nervous. But Isn't that something which must be overcome if we want to protect the society?
Absolutely. And I'm sure, we're talking about something that happened some weeks ago.
Right.
I'm sure that we are actually, all of us, coming to terms with this. See, in my situation, I used to be a surgeon. I'm very familiar with wearing a mask. I've also worked for quite a long time in Southeast Asia. I'm familiar with it. I think for some people it's easier than others. But if you don't mind, it'd be much easier for me if I'm not required to actually make a direct comment on what somebody else has done in a situation where I do not know the circumstances. The first thing I knew about it was when you raised it just a few minutes ago. And I think I'd much rather talk to the person concerned and find out more about the circumstances rather than make a judgmental comment now. So I'm not going to say any more.
Dr. Nabarro, you have witnessed similar pandemic diseases in the past. Is the COVID-19 special in any way?
Yes. Oh, it's just the most intense and difficult thing that I've ever encountered. I mean, I've dealt with outbreaks of Ebola with a higher mortality rate. And yes, that was horrible. And dealing with it in West Africa during 2014 was very distressing. But this is on a scale that is so much greater. Half a million people already recorded as dying of this disease. So the scale is huge. And the second thing I want to say is that it's not going away. So its persistence is guaranteed, and its persistence is everywhere. And last point is it's really badly affecting poorer people. People who come from ethnicities where poverty is more likely, and people in parts of the world where poverty is greater. So in terms of the scale, in terms of the duration, and in terms of the poverty impact, this is enormous. And what worries me is that the world as a whole seems to be much less conscious of the seriousness of the problem than it has been when dealing with other problems that I've been put onto in earlier years. So this is more serious than West Africa Ebola. This is more serious than H1N1 influenza of 2009. It's more serious than bird flu of 2005. It's more serious than some of the big cholera outbreaks that I've been involved in. This is really deadly serious. It needs to be taken seriously by all nations, and it needs unity of purpose by all national leaders to get on top of it.
Going back to the infections or epidemics of SARS, for example, did we learn anything from them we can use now when we fight COVID-19?
Yes. The countries that experienced SARS in 2003 learned four things. One, you have to involve your people to the full in dealing with this threat. You can't order them to do things. They have to be fully involved and take responsibility. Secondly, you do need strong community level public health capacity to identify people with the disease and isolate them and to trace their contacts. Number three, you have to sort out hospitals. So they've got parts of the hospital that are for people with the disease and parts of the hospital for people with other conditions. And fourthly, you absolutely need to get the whole of government working in unity on the issue. If you've got differences of opinion between different parts of government, all sorts of problems happen. These lessons were applied by East Asian countries at the beginning of COVID. That's why Dr. Tedros was actually praising them in January, something that he was criticized for. But he was praising them because they actually learned the lesson of SARS and they did what was right. And in fact, since the end of January, WHO as an organization has been advocating these four core elements of involving the people, doing the public health, getting hospitals reconfigured, and putting the whole of government and the whole of society behind the response. And it's been advocating it at very regular intervals. It's not shifted. Okay, there's been some details that have changed, but the position of the organization has been consistent. And I think when the history is written, the question will be, why was it that quite a lot of countries did not follow the experience of East Asia, which was experience that was strongly influenced by SARS?
Dr. Nabarro, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. I hope I gave reasonable answers to your questions. I'm sorry there were one or two I couldn't answer, but do by all means, let's have another conversation if you would find it helpful.